Great. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the Business Science Magazine podcast. I'm here with Dr. Alicia Alvaro. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce her properly. And I'm just going to read a quick bio. So Dr. Alvaro is an Associate Provost and Assistant Vice President of Faculty and Academic Affairs at Queens College, the City University of New York, who applies her skills as a training, leadership, and performance management consultant to help strengthen the experiences of faculty, staff, and students within higher education. Dr. Alvaro has extensive experience teaching leaders across a number of domains, including human service organizations, how to utilize behavior management principles to help solve organizational challenges. She holds a bachelor's in psychology from FIU, Golden Panthers, and a master's and PhD in IO psychology and applied behavior analysis from Western Michigan University. Dr. Alvaro was awarded the prestigious Ford Foundation Fellowship while at Western Michigan University for her research in behavioral safety. She has published in various journals, including the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, Journal of Organizational Behavior Management, Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior, and Behavior Analysis in Practice. She has also served on several editorial boards. Dr. Alvaro has been an invited speaker across the country to share her knowledge and experiences, and we are lucky enough to have her with us today, sharing some more of her experiences. So I really enjoyed doing a little bit of research on your career, Alicia, and I ran across all of your scholarly notations, and I'm really excited to talk about feedback specifically. But before we get into that, I was hoping that we could just talk about the basics of organizational behavior management. So that's really the foundation of our enterprise at Business Science Magazine, and so many people define organizational behavior management in their own way. So could you talk a little bit about what organizational behavior management is?
Yes, I will say the way I explain it to people, the difference between OBM, in my opinion, and more traditional business management approaches is really teaching an organization how to solve problems continuously and continuously problem solve versus going in and addressing one thing and not transferring the skill set to the organization that then they can learn how to identify a problem and how to manage and continuously grow. Is the easiest way I find to explain to people that are not behavior analysts that explain it very differently and just say probably the more traditional answer, which is using ABA in the workplace. And that really it was that science that drew me to OBM. But I definitely talk about it a little differently when people just ask what the difference is between OBM and traditional business approaches.
Absolutely, and I find everybody has their own way of defining it, even within OBM a little bit. Yeah. So you did publish an article on the differences between industrial organizational psychology and organizational behavior management. So could you talk a little bit about what IO psychology is and how it's different from organizational behavior management?
Yes, absolutely. So I think one of the main differences is in the way in which we solve organizational problems, really involving consequences a lot more than the traditional IO. Traditional IO concentrates very heavily on antecedent manipulations and training and even identifying causes of behavior, attribute a lot to antecedents versus organizational behavior. It's more the entire picture and looking at the environment a lot more versus the individual, recognizing very strong impact that the environment has on individuals. It's not to say at the exclusion of looking at the individual level, but I think it just looks at a broader picture. And the consequence and management of consequences is really different between the two approaches.
Absolutely. You know, I love bringing this example up. I think it's so powerful and so simple. In Judy Agnew and Aubrey Daniels' safety book, they have this great example about signs in regards to behavioral safety. And this actually happened to me recently where I was doing an OBM consult, and we walked into a manufacturing plant, and there was all sorts of signs everywhere that said, wear your personal protective equipment.
Right.
And so we went into a big room where there was a whole bunch of employees, and there was only 3 people wearing their PPE, and those 3 people were the 3 consultants that were there.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I started thinking about it, and something that Judy Agnew talks about in her book is you can have signs everywhere, those antecedents saying, please wear your PPE. But if there's no consequences, if there's nothing happening afterwards, then it's really not going to change behavior. So in the example she gives is, if there was a sign that said free ice cream in the lunchroom, and there was free ice cream in the lunchroom, everybody would show up to the lunchroom. So I loved your example there, talking about the entire picture of antecedents and consequences. And
Absolutely. Like one of the first things I do when I consult for a company, and oftentimes they just want me to come in, do training and provide some type of training to their leaders, and that's it. And I say, when I'm explaining what antecedents are, and the biggest challenge with the antecedents is that if there's no follow-up, then it's really pointless. And I openly admit I'm giving a training, and training is an antecedent manipulation. And so while I appreciate that you want me here and then you're asking me for here, I recognize that this is not going to be enough to help you or your organization if there are no consequences as a result. And so you can learn as much as you want, but whether or not you actually implement these tools and actually utilize them is very different. And I really stress that because I want them to understand that they're not just paying me to come in and give a training. I hope they recognize that it's a long-term relationship. They should be contacting me and saying, afterwards, we wanted to try and implement this and we ran into this roadblock, and they should forever feel like they can reach out to me because I want to do everything to ensure that they can actually put the tools that I provide to good use. And so that's something that it's definitely at the forefront of conversations I have with people.
Yeah, I've noticed, to your point, it's almost like some organizations just want to meet certain policies or protocol and say, yes, we did that training, right?
Yep, check.
Yeah, exactly. They're just checking off a box somewhere. So It's always nice, when they give you the call back and say, okay, we've done the training, so, how can we make sure to contemplate behavior appropriately, right?
That's right, yeah.
So what are some of the industries that you've worked in? So I'm assuming that you've done a good amount of work in safety, right?
Yes. During my time in Michigan, because it's kind of the mecca of manufacturing plants, school supply, car parts, you name it. I don't know if there's an industry I was not involved in that exists in Michigan. And then when I first left and came to New York, I was invited to do some safety work in vineyards in Oregon, and that was really quite fun. It wasn't just safety, it was also leadership training, trying to get Spanish-speaking employees, who were the ones that pick the grapes off the vines. There was this culture that they could never be promoted, they could never be a supervisor, and it was almost, it was very difficult to break that culture. They felt like this is all we are, bottom level employees. And so a lot of the vineyards, the organizational hierarchy, very male and white male dominated. And then the Latinos were the ones that were, and so they wanted to try and break this culture. And Kent Anger had this grant that was to try and provide training in Spanish to the migrant workers. And it was a combination of behavioral safety as well as leadership to try and promote them. So that was one of the funnest and most unique industries that I was involved in. And then I worked for the FDNY for a long time, and that was great. It was because one of their deputy chiefs came back to school and was in my class and took my organizational behavior management class and loved it. And so I worked with them for a really long time. And human service industry, I think it's unavoidable, the way ABA has grown in autism. So I've worked with a lot of those industries. And then most recently, how I ended up in this role, which is higher education, utilizing the tools that I've learned in OBM to improve practices across the university, and being fortunate enough to be in an institution that recognizes that, and I'm constantly brought into the table for a lot of discussions, and asked, how to change this and what should we do. And so at a systems level, training level, I'm involved in almost every conversation when it comes to trying to make important decisions about beneficial change for higher ed.
Do you find that they implement the suggestions that you provide?
So far, so good. Yes. I mean, I have learned to be a level of patience I didn't know I had, because higher ed, in higher ed, I think, especially in the institution I'm in, that's such a complex, large institution. So the City University of New York is the largest higher ed institution in the nation, and very similar to Cal State, where we're 25 universities in the system, and ours, Queens College alone, is 20,000 students, and that's just one of the 25. And so we have a central office. So it's not just about going through all the complex layers within our institution. Within our institution, then we have to go to the central office, and then central office reports to the state of New York. So it's a lot of layers of getting things changed and processes changed. And so I've learned to be really patient, but most of the time they do pan out, and it's a very rewarding feeling. It's just very, very delayed reinforcement.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I was an adjunct professor at FIU for about 9 years, and something that I always worked with the director of the behavior analysis department on was instructional design. So I always felt like that was a big deal for universities. So do you feel like there's other areas of the university system where OBMers, or people that practice organizational behavior management, can help out?
Absolutely. So one of the parallels I have found with my leadership work across organizations and higher ed is the lack of proper leadership training. And so the chairs, department chairs, are researchers in a particular field. So they have a PhD in history, philosophy, anthropology, and then all of a sudden they're thrown into this role where they have to manage, and it's a managerial role, and absolutely no training. But now they're expected to balance budgets, hire adjuncts, train them, ensure that they maintain high standards, evaluate them, evaluate faculty, staff, guide them through tenure, promotion, and that is a skill set that is not innate. As an OBMer, we know that. And so that's area number one, just leadership training at the basic level. And I say basic level at the chair level because a lot of institutions don't provide it for their deans, provost, and any of their executives. So across all areas, I think leadership training within higher education is critical. And then things such within my department, when I was in the psychology department, I implemented a training and feedback system for the adjuncts. We would hire between 70 and 90 a semester I hired. And I found that managing them and ensuring that they were up to par and providing them with the tools necessary to succeed, all of that was a structure that was non-existent when I became deputy chair of the department. So I built all of that into place. But using OBM skills, just knowing we need feedback. They need, first of all, do they have the tools necessary? So essentially going through the John Austin's performance diagnostic checklist, do they have the tools necessary? And the answer was no. We would say, here's a class, figure it out. We didn't provide them suggestions on textbooks, sample syllabus. We didn't provide any of that, and now we do. And then a feedback system, we do an evaluation, but what would happen if it was a weak evaluation? Sometimes we were desperate and we'd still just rehire them, or we wouldn't rehire them. And so I thought, as a behavior analyst, should we be giving people an opportunity to grow and learn and provide the feedback necessary to become better? And so I developed a mechanism for that. So managing part-time employees, full-time employees, guiding them. So now as associate provost, one of the things I'm doing at a much larger scale is a lot of higher ed institutions, the ranks of professors, you're guided and given a lot of individualized feedback when it comes to tenure and promotion from assistant professor to associate professor. But most faculty stay at associate professor. It's really quite difficult to find an institution where people move up to the ranks of full professor the way in which they do to associate. So they take on a lot of other administrative roles. They don't continue with their research trajectory that they did. But problem number one is that you tend to build a system to get faculty to tenure and promotion successfully. They meet with their chair every semester, if not yearly. There's a review. You're monitoring them, providing them with feedback, and then you never meet with them again once they get associate. And so I realized, well, that's not healthy. So is it because people really don't want to get promoted, which is what people tend to think, that, oh, they just want to stay associate professor, or are we really not providing them with the feedback and guidance and the tools necessary to get there? And so that's my pet project now, is how can we change that? How can we change the needle and make a difference? And so yeah, I mean, the list goes on and on. Hiring practice is another area in which, and I recently published in that, how we hire, the process, the steps in the process is really not a very efficient process within academia. So OBM can be used, you name it, and I'm sure the problem exists within higher education.
I do want to ask about one thing in particular that I am curious about. You talked a lot about professors, faculty, people that are already have their PhDs, but something I've always been curious about is the PhD process. So I only have my master's degree, and I've given a lot of thought to getting my PhD at some point, but I've always found the route to getting a PhD at a lot of universities to be not clear. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I've noticed that other universities are stepping in now and saying, we've mapped out all of your goals, so very goal-oriented, and said, these are your objectives. We want you to meet this, 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 and this. They pinpoint exactly what they want you to do. And yet I've noticed at more prestigious universities, they tend not to pinpoint tasks and objectives as much for students to get their PhD versus master's. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's an old, this is a traditional view on education, and some people are having a hard time kind of catching up. It's that mentality, and I see it in med schools as well. Well, we went through it. That's the way we did it. And I can't deny the one thing that I think will be difficult to change with the PhD is the process of a dissertation. You can map out the curriculum and get that process really laid out, and the framework for succeeding in courses, but really mapped out. But the challenge is students don't stumble on that. The reality is they're expert students by the time they're going for a PhD. So getting through the program, really any challenges that are faced by students is not because of the coursework. So So I get mapping that process out, but I still think there's a long way to go about mapping out the support necessary to get your PhD, your dissertation. And that, ABD, there's a lot of students that are all about dissertation because the challenge is that dissertation. So 2 thoughts on it. Could we do a better job of providing individualized guidance and feedback on every step of the way and laying out the expectations for the dissertation and following up? Absolutely. However, if the training of a PhD is to produce an academic, when you are a faculty member, if you are given that level of guidance to write your dissertation, you're going to find it really, really hard then to be a successful academic, because you're hired and then it's up to you to do your research, and no one is providing those self-imposed goals or deadlines, I should say, for publishing. And so, yeah, there has to be this middle ground. It's like teaching a child to walk. You can't hold their hand too long because you need them to learn how to do it on their own. And I think we struggle with that. Where do we teach that level of independence? You see that in parenting. Now people talk about helicopter parenting, where parents don't want to ever step back. And in higher ed, I can say we've seen that. We've seen a difference in students, and they come in expecting parents to be a lot more involved than they've ever been involved in higher ed. And so I think we have room to grow in that area, but it's hard to find that balance where you still have too many people with the old school train of thought that we should never change and it should just be that way, versus those that recognize there needs to be a change, but how do you implement those changes without creating a dependency that's healthy and not beneficial to them when we want them to be successful in their careers? And that's a challenge. I think that's a challenge with PhD. PsyD might be different. And I've had this discussion recently with people, like, if we're trying to fill a void because we need more doctors in applied behavior analysis, do we need to start making a move more towards training practitioners in a different way? And so a PsyD might be an option versus the PhD, where traditionally the PhD is to train academics. So a lot of discussion and potential for changes and growth, but I agree, it is, the PhD is a lot more about a test in persistence and perseverance, in my opinion, than necessarily practicality.
Absolutely, and I'm sure we could spend another hour operationally defining perseverance and sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting when you were talking about helicopter parenting and things like that. I believe a famous faculty member through City University of New York, Jonathan Haidt, wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, where he talks about that very thing. Yeah. Not sure if you've read it or not, but so we talked a bit about, or you talked a little bit about how faculty members are kind of dumped with a lot of responsibility that they don't have training on. So that I think is a good segue into the next question, which is if administrators at universities or organizations or the government or anywhere wanted to develop their skill set in behavior science or organizational behavior management, where would be a good place to do that? I think you're a perfect person to ask because you went to, in my opinion, probably the best graduate school in the world for organizational behavior management and maybe behavior analysis at Western Michigan. So where's a good place for people to develop those skill sets?
Well, I think the OBM network is a good first step. I think the people involved in that network are the top people. They're the experts. Now, is it accessible to all? that's tough because you either have to be in the network to access things. I do notice that a lot about the network, and so that's a limitation. But if you put it all out there for everybody, then people don't join the network. And so where's the happy medium? I think there's still a little bit of work to kind of go on that. I also I struggle with that question myself, because as the need for OBM rises, and I think we're seeing that a lot now, a lot of these ABA agencies saying, oh, we need help in OBM. A lot of people all of a sudden are hanging signs out, and saying, oh, I can do OBM, I can do OBM. And so I worry a little bit about not standardizing or having, I know there's been some efforts to create certificates and things, but if you Google it, you can find, a lot of certifications in OBM that are not helpful. So I would love to see perhaps the OBM network be the central place to kind of say, these are good places and these are the right places. Not necessarily needing a list that says these are not the right places, but almost at that organizational level, certifying a program or certifying the same way ABAI has done that, where you're certified, and the ABA schools, that's the kind of license that's what you need. The clinical psych programs, you need to be APA accredited. That's the standard, the gold standard. We don't have anything like that in behavior analysis for OBM, I should say specifically. And so that's a hard question to answer. Anything published by, the great people in the field like Aubrey Daniels and John Bailey and John Austin. I mean, those are all great resources, and their books are designed for practitioners, so they're easy to read. I recommend a lot of those books because if you want formal training, then you definitely need to do something related to, I would say, Western Michigan and OBM network. Start there. University of Nevada, Reno has a great place and a great program. FIT does as well. So I would say start with the big names and ask. It's the one thing I struggle with, because I don't think we have a great place to send people.
So are you, it's interesting because I've had this discussion with so many OBMers, and I haven't taken data on it, but just from an outside perspective, it seems like the field of OBM is split 50-50 in reference to standardization and having an OBM certification. Mm-hmm. So I bring that up to some people and they get really excited, and you seem to be in favor of it. And then I brought it up to other people that have directly told me that's a terrible idea. So Are you more in favor of certification?
If we could do certification and avoid all the politics that come with it. So I think that people are against it. I understand why, because it becomes this thing. Like now with BCBA, we see it here in New York. In New York State decided they were going to create their own licensure. And so now you have to be New York State licensed in BCBA. The numbers of students in our program almost disappeared overnight. No one wants their BCBA in New York, because that's not what gets you the jobs in New York anymore, even though the test is pretty much, I would say, exactly the same. And so I suspect in the future a lot more states are going to start branching off and creating their own. Part of it is going to be money making. Why are people going to be paying for licensure and certification to an agency that's the state's not profiting from? And so those are the complexities and the politics that ruin it for me and ruin it for people. But when it comes to knowing whether or not you're really getting the right product, I don't know how else you do it if you don't have experts and certifying and saying and validating, because otherwise anyone can say I'm great at it. And I was just watching something on TV yesterday without FDA regulations on certain things, how now people say, oh yeah, these are legal drugs, and it was about drugs, and so where does the FDA need to step in, and where does there need to be some type of monitoring, because now people can make any claim they want, and teenagers believe because these things are legal, these off-brand products that they buy, that they're safe. And so they're not synonymous. Legal and safety are not synonymous. And so I feel that way about any field of science. You know, OBMs saying that they do it right versus misleading and deceptive practices, or just not even being based in the science, worries me, because it's going to give us a really bad name if we have too many people out there claiming to be OBMers and aren't actually trained correctly.
All good points. Another topic.
I'm on the fence, I should say.
Well, I mean, those are all good points. I feel like this is another one of those topics we could have an hour and a half long panel discussion on with, you know, 5 or 6 other people.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to kind of venture out of our OBM bubble that we spend so much time in, and kind of discuss the world of work in general. So through your teaching and consulting, what are some of the trends that you see in the world of business that you think are going to change the workplace in the decades to come, and where do you see OBM fitting in there?
So I would say that, I mean, the easiest answer has to do with the use of technology and virtual meetings and working remotely. That I see more and more all the time, like organizations within, even in education, online teaching, hybrid courses, the use of technology is one of the most obvious changes that's infiltrating every layer within organizations, not just higher ed. So with that comes this added layer of, you know, removing yourself from face-to-face interactions and having that kind of opportunity. When we talk about leadership and feedback and providing people with guidance, mentorship, all of these kinds of things, the way we talk about it is very much in the traditional sense, assuming there's face-to-face contact, assuming that people are going to know what each other looks like. And so when you're kind of removing some of those layers, it does add a level of complexity. Just text messaging, writing, discussion boards, how somebody interprets something without having a tone or inflection in the way you are really meaning it or intending it to come out, adds a level of complexity. You know, self-generated rules is one of the most complicated things to work with in organizations. And now when you're kind of removing the face-to-face and the direct contact, you are adding a little bit more complexity and more opportunity for people to self-generate inaccurate rules that then govern their behavior. And so OBM has the same place it always had in leadership training and performance management. It's just now having to pay a little bit more attention to what are those things, what are those rules, the right way and wrong way. We talk about the right way of delivering feedback. It's still very traditional, the way we provide that training. It's about what to say and what not to say, what information to include. But now if all that information is going to be virtual, then how we train and what we include in those statements about what's right and wrong needs to consider that and have that as a consideration.
I think that's such a great point, especially about remote work. That's something I have a little bit of experience with, and something that I noticed is with remote workers, it's absolutely critical to have your scorecard for that particular employee mapped out with exact measures of what you expect from them, because we're missing out, like you said, on that one-to-one interaction or being in an office where you can just walk by and give them feedback in the moment and things like that. And it's not that you can't now. I'm sure you can do that maybe easier using technology, but with remote work, I think that that's a critical place where OBM can really dive in.
Absolutely, and where employees don't get to just look at their colleague to see how they're doing it, and even that checks and balance. So even if it's not feedback from the supervisor, when you're not working directly next to somebody where you can just ask them, or even just glance and see how they do it and then follow suit, you're missing out on a lot of potential opportunities and ways in which people traditionally learn on the job, whether right or wrong. So you have to be aware of that we need to make sure we're paying attention to that.
Absolutely, and you've brought up performance feedback a few times, and I was really excited to talk to you about feedback for a few different reasons, but the one that's really on my mind is the article that you co-wrote with Barbara Buckland and John Austin. And for everybody out there, it's titled An Objective Review of the Effectiveness and Essential Characteristics of Performance Feedback in Organizational Settings. And really what you're doing in there is a review of Balcazar, Hopkins, and Suarez's 1985 article, which is really the seminal article, I think, on performance feedback. And I wanted to bring this up, and this is a selfish, shameless plug here, but I'm working with 3 other colleagues, and we're finalizing a book on performance feedback. And it was your article with Barbara and Dr. Austin that inspired us to write the book. And there was a couple of components in there that I wanted to discuss with you. And there's a quote in there that you have in the article by Norm Peterson, where he talks about feedback just being professional slang, and that it really isn't behavioral in any sense. It's not a special type of principle. And it really made all of us, myself and my co-authors, think about the definition of performance feedback from a behavior analytics standpoint. So I wanted to get as many of your thoughts as time will permit on performance feedback. So let's start with the most simple question. How do you define performance feedback?
Well, first, I'm very excited that you're working on a book, and I can't wait to I look forward very much to reading it. Performance feedback is a topic I'm asked a lot about, and I have a lot of thoughts on it. I agree with Aubrey Daniels' definition, where performance feedback really is information that allows a person to change his or her behavior. And the challenge is, from a behavioral point of view, I really do think it's slang. I don't think when you talk about the behavioral function and you talk about information about performance that can change it is the consequence. And we know all of the behavioral consequences out there. And if it's, positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, or, positive or negative punishment, then why do we need the word feedback involved with it? And so it's because we are providing information that can serve as an antecedent. Because when you provide somebody information with a goal and tell them, you need to reach this goal, then are we just talking about an antecedent? Are we talking about a relationship between an antecedent and a consequence? And then there's a contingency, whether it's direct or indirect. And so all those situations are sometimes used and described as feedback. And we could just as easily break them apart into what all the individualized components are of situation. So does it have a use? Absolutely. If we want to talk to any normal, non-behavior analytic person, we have to use feedback, because how else can we really explain what we mean when we say information that can change behavior? People are not going to understand unless you talk about it in that way. I worry about people using it incorrectly when we say good job, and oh, that's feedback. I mean, that I worry about, because then that's inaccurate, because that's not information that's going to help a person change, because it's not specific enough. I mean, it's just a statement. It could be praise, or it could be a punishing, depending on its effect on behavior. But it's missing that component about what exactly did they do correctly, or what did they do incorrectly. And so that one is easier, to know which statements I wouldn't consider feedback, but the ones I would I could usually take them apart and identify what's the antecedent and what's the consequence, depending on its effect on behavior. And so it's almost like it's a label of a group of behavioral principles, and it can vary very much. There's no prescribed way of providing it. So that's a long-winded, complicated answer, maybe more than you wanted, but those are my thoughts on it.
No, absolutely. In fact, I've got more questions. So
yeah.
I love discussing performance feedback. So I heard you say something earlier when we were talking about some of the difficulties in universities, some of the challenges that OBM could address, and you talked about giving, and I think you were referring to adjunct instructors or something like that, giving them an opportunity to change their behavior by giving them more frequent feedback. So that's something that Aubrey Daniels talks about all the time, the problem with, as well as the feedback sandwich. We can talk about that later, but he talks about, the problems with annual performance reviews. So could you talk a little bit about annual performance reviews and their effectiveness with regards to feedback and changing behavior?
Well, I would not use annual evaluation and effective in the same sentence, because I just don't see how that could ever work. And if anything, I always, whenever I'm giving a lecture on or a workshop on how negatively I feel about annual evaluations, I always bring my poor husband into the story, because he worked in a hospital setting for a really long time, and it was always around the end of the year when he'd have his yearly evaluation, and he was rated on a scale of 1 to 5 on all of these criteria. And he probably hated being married to me right before that evaluation every year, because I'd sit him down and say, okay, so what are you going to ask? When they say you got a 3, say, what can I do to get a 4? What would you like to see in me in order to get a 4? He's like, oh my God, this is what being married to a behavior analyst is all about. Because I knew they would never quantify it. I knew they wouldn't. That was the point. I just wanted him to try, and everyone would get a 3 no matter what. And so he would get so frustrated, because he felt like anything he did every year was just the same thing. It was always a 3, and everyone got a 3. No, because it was tied directly towards your increase in pay, so no one would get more than the 3% increase in pay. It was crazy to get a 5% increase. And so, that was a whole other problem with that yearly evaluation, but it just never worked. People always got angry as a result of that one meeting, because it really just captures, it's the recency effect is the biggest problem with it. Whatever the supervisor saw most recently is what they're going to point out. And even if you have really objective and clear criteria on your rating scale, once a year is not enough, because so much can change from day to day, let alone year to year. So if we then start increasing, let's say you have an objective tool and then you start increasing the frequency, then maybe you're talking about something that can be a little bit more effective. But I strongly believe that the best leaders, it's part of their natural repertoire. It's not such a formalized, and it could start off as a formalized system, and I think there are many reasons why we have to have formalized system of performance evaluations, but I think it's a conversation. I think it's something that should just be discussed with employees, with colleagues. We should constantly be checking in on our own behavior. We should be soliciting feedback. I solicit feedback from everyone I work with all of the time, because I want to make sure that A, I know where I stand, but B, more importantly, I want people to constantly feel comfortable knowing that they could come to me. And the only way people feel comfortable is if they feel like it is a conversational piece, and it is something that that I am looking for, and there's value to providing it, because there's nothing worse than feeling like you can't talk to somebody because they're never going to listen, they're never going to change, or what's it going to do. So I try and erase all of that from anyone's mind. I want them to know that. So I crave feedback. I want to know how I'm doing all of the time, and because I want to monitor my own progress. I can create my own rules about how fabulous I think I am, but that's not very useful if others don't agree with that. So yes, much more frequent. You have to be willing to have that conversation, and the best feedback is conversational and just part of the job.
That's great. Yeah, and you just answered a couple of more questions that I had, and with our time left, I do want to ask one or two more questions about feedback, and then talk a little bit about where people that are interested in learning more about the work that you're doing can find you. But with regards to feedback, something that we talk about in our book is not just what feedback is from a behavioral standpoint, and not just how to provide it, but also how to accept it. And that's something that you were just talking about there. So do you feel like it's important to not only train supervisors and managers on how to provide feedback to their staff, but to also provide training to staff on how to accept? And in your case, I think that's part of that acceptance repertoire, is reinforcing the manager's feedback behavior by requesting more.
Correct.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that training people on how to receive feedback is critical. I mean, I think it's absolutely necessary. It's also an integral part of training professionalism in novice employees, and so college students even, and this will make more sense when I talk about it, but also in training leaders. There's a place to talk about it on all different levels. And so the most direct piece of advice I always offer is remove emotionalism. Like, there's no place for emotionalism when you're accepting feedback. You know, you're going to have that gut reaction and that knee-jerk reaction, but everyone can write the dream email and hit delete. Like, that's great advice across all different levels. It was advice that was shared to me by a colleague at Western Michigan, actually, and her and her husband went off to create an amazing company, and like, they're so successful. But I knew them from my time in Miami, and they said there's just no room for emotionalism in behavior analysis and in feedback, and I agree with that completely. And so I think in delivering feedback, in accepting feedback, you can incorporate it into many different things, but that is the most important thing, to just listen, digest it. You can have that internal reaction and emotional reaction, but it's about learning to keep it to yourself and having time to digest before then talking about it. So it has to be from the person giving the feedback, allowing them, the person that they're delivering the feedback to have time to digest, to communicate about it at a different point in time, expecting that they react and get everything off their chest, positive or negative, in that moment, sets everyone up for failure. Because then what you're asking for is for that emotional reaction, and that can only do harm. It's never the right thing to do. And not just in the negative sense, sometimes in the positive sense. Sometimes you get overly excited and maybe commit to things and say things you don't really mean. So it's not only in the negative sense. We tend to be, emotional beings and react emotionally to things, whether they're really great or really bad. And so I think training people to curb that and sit on it and digest it and then come back is a very healthy thing to train.
Sage advice, sage advice. So with our few remaining minutes here, I wanted to talk about what's next in your career and where can people hear you speak, or if somebody was interested in your consulting services, something along those lines. So I guess what's next for you? We'll start with that question. So what are you working on next that you'd like to share with the audience?
Great questions. So internally and externally, I'll answer that because I'm working on so many different things. Internally in this role, because I'm responsible for faculty and academic affairs, I mentioned earlier that I'm kind of taking it upon myself to change the needle as far as associate professors and helping them get to full professor here within Queens College. I'm also working on providing opportunities for professional growth and development. That's something that I feel really strongly about. I think we oftentimes don't know where to go next, and you have a job, but where do you want to go next, and what are the skills and the steps necessary? And so professional growth and development opportunities is something that I'm working on internally here within the university and excited about. But consulting wise, I have to say, because this job takes so much from me, I turn down a lot more than I can accept at this point in time. And I would say 99% of the opportunities right now are with ABA agencies and human service agencies growing very rapidly, realizing that they need some guidance and some OBM training and consulting. And so it's pretty much timing whether or not I can have the time to accept a consulting job of that nature. One of the clients I worked with last summer, they're one of the largest ABA agencies here in New York. We are, they took my sage advice. I did workshops and trained all of their top executives, middle managers, and they are changing everything top down within their organization. And we're presenting at ABA at Washington, D.C. So we're very excited about that because I told them that was the deal. I said, listen, I'm going to do all this, but because I'm so excited about the things that they're doing. And I think that, so we're going to have a panel discussion. I think that's what we're leaning towards. Well, we'll have their CEO and then the two trainers who've taken this initiative on them. So we'll have all the different perspectives. So the kind of the middle managers, the top executives, and then the consultant, and what are the things that have done, what's yielded great success, and that kind of stuff. So so that's where I'll be next as far as in the behavior analytic world. And then the higher ed leadership stuff, that continues to be where I'm most excited. So.
Very cool, very cool. And I was, like I said earlier, I really enjoyed doing the research for this interview because, I went through and you have somewhere around 25 to 30 different articles on different aspects of organizational behavior management. We didn't get a chance to talk about safety today, but for anybody out there that's listening, Dr. Alvaro has a lot of experience in safety and has published several papers on that in a variety of different journals. So I encourage everybody to take a look at that when you get a chance. Dr. Alvaro, I wanted to take a moment here and thank you for joining us. And
thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
Excellent, excellent.